My name is Brianna Hayes. I'm 34 years old, and 3 days ago, I became a widow. I thought the hardest part would be standing beside my husband's casket and saying goodbye. I was wrong. The hardest part was looking at the front row and realizing that his entire family was missing. Not one of them came. I checked my phone before the service started. No calls, no messages. I waited until the funeral ended, thinking maybe they had been delayed. Nothing. Then, while I was standing outside the cemetery, my phone buzzed. It was a photo from someone who had been at the funeral. I opened it. My husband's parents were in the picture. So was his brother. They weren't at the cemetery. They were dressed for a wedding. I stared at the screen, trying to understand what I was looking at. They had skipped their own son's funeral to attend a wedding for a relative. Then another message came through. This time, it was from my father-in-law. I opened it expecting an explanation. Instead, it said, "Pack your things. The house isn't yours." I read it twice. My husband had been buried less than an hour earlier, and his family was already telling me to leave the home we had shared. I had no idea why they suddenly believed they could take my house, but I was about to find out that the message was only the beginning. If you've ever faced something this cruel from your own family, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And stay with me, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my husband's family. The next morning, Douglas came to the house before I had finished my coffee. I had barely set the mug down when someone knocked twice. When I opened the door, Douglas stood there with Marilyn and Brandon behind him. None of them asked how I was doing. Douglas stepped inside as if he still had the authority to decide what happened in my home. "We need to talk about the house," he said. I moved away from the doorway. "About what?" Brandon carried a thin folder under his arm. He placed it on the kitchen counter and looked at his father. Douglas opened it. "Matthew's assets belong to his family," he said. "You need to understand that before this gets any more difficult." I stared at him. "Matthew was my husband." "That doesn't change where the money came from," Douglas replied. "Before he married you, I paid for his education, helped him buy his first car, and gave him money when he was getting started. Your house was purchased with money Matthew had because of us." Marilyn finally spoke. "We're not trying to be cruel, Brianna. We're trying to protect what belongs to our family." I looked at the papers Brandon had brought. There was a mortgage statement, a copy of the closing disclosure, and several records showing payments made toward the down payment years earlier. "Why do you have these?" Douglas gave me a flat look. "Because we prepared for this." The answer stopped me. "You prepared for what?" "For Matthew's estate," Brandon said. He said it casually, almost as though we were discussing a business transaction. I pulled the mortgage statement closer and read through the figures. The house was still financed, and Matthew's name appeared on the loan documents. My name was there too. I pointed at the page. "This mortgage has both our names." "That doesn't mean you own everything," Douglas said. "I never said I owned everything. You're acting like you do." I looked at Marilyn. "Did you all come here expecting me to sign something?" She hesitated before answering. "We want you to move out while we sort everything out." I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "Move out of my house?" Douglas leaned forward. "It's not simply your house, Brianna. Matthew put money into it before you were married. That money came from us." I pushed the papers back toward him. "And the mortgage payments after we got married?" Douglas did not answer immediately. Brandon stepped in. "Matthew handled those." "So did I." He looked at me. "I paid half the mortgage for years," I said. "I paid utilities. I paid property taxes. I paid for repairs. I have bank records for all of it." Douglas shook his head. "That's household spending. It doesn't change the source of the original money." I could hear exactly what he was doing. He was separating every dollar Matthew had before our marriage from everything we had built afterward, then pretending the second category did not matter. I opened the folder again. "Show me exactly what you believe belongs to you." Douglas pointed to the documents. "The down payment. The money Matthew had in his account when he bought the house. Some of the investment money connected to the purchase. We helped him get started, and we never expected you to take control of it after he died." "I'm not taking control of anything," I said. "I'm trying to understand why you came here the morning after his funeral telling me to leave." Marilyn looked down at the counter. "We thought it would be easier if we handled these things quickly." "Easier for who?" She didn't answer. Brandon pulled another page from the folder. This shows the amount Matthew had in his account before the marriage. I read the number, then looked at him. How does that prove the money still belongs to you? It proves where it came from. No, it proves where some of it came from. Brandon frowned. Douglas cut in. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Matthew was our son. We supported him long before you were in his life, and then I became his wife, I said. For 8 years. Douglas's expression hardened. That doesn't erase what we gave him. I stood there for a moment, looking at the three of them. They had arrived with paperwork already organized, numbers already highlighted, and a plan for what they wanted me to do. The speed of it bothered me more than the demand itself. Matthew had died 3 days ago. They were already discussing his money. I turned another page and found a copy of the original closing statement. The down payment was listed separately from the mortgage. Matthew had contributed money before our marriage, but the documents also showed years of payments made afterward. I tapped the page. This doesn't say the house belongs to you. Douglas reached for the document. We'll have attorneys review that. You already have attorneys? His eyes shifted briefly toward Brandon. We've spoken to people who understand estate matters. That answer told me more than he intended. I closed the folder. If you believe you have a legal claim to my home, then show me the document that says so. Douglas stood. You're making a mistake by fighting us. I'm not fighting anyone. I'm asking you to prove what you're claiming. Brandon picked up the folder. Douglas walked toward the door, then stopped. There's another asset we need to discuss. That afternoon, I drove to the store Matthew and I had spent 8 years building. Hayes Family Market sat on a busy corner about 15 minutes from our house, and I had known every part of that place long before anyone started talking about what it was worth. When I walked through the front entrance, the assistant manager, Rachel, looked up from the service desk and immediately came toward me. Brianna, I didn't know if you were coming in today. Neither did I said. But I need to check something. She nodded and followed me into the small office behind the registers. The store was operating normally, but something about the office felt different. A folder that usually stayed in the locked cabinet was sitting on the desk. I opened it and checked the business account statements, payroll records, vendor agreements, and the ownership documents Matthew and I had signed years earlier. My name was on every major document I expected to see. Then Rachel quietly said, Brandon was here this morning. I looked up. What did he want? He asked for access to the business account. I told him I couldn't give it to him without authorization. Before I could answer, the office door opened. Brandon walked in holding his phone. He looked at the papers on the desk, then at me. You came here fast. This is my business too, I said. Brandon pulled out a document. Dad wants the accounts under family control until the estate is settled. I stared at him. On what authority? Dad says it was Matthew's investment. It wasn't. Brandon frowned. He put the money into this place before you two were married. Some money may have been used to help Matthew get started, I said, but that does not make the entire business his father's property. I opened the company records and turned the ownership page toward him. Look. Brandon leaned over the desk. The document clearly showed Matthew Hayes holding 50% of the company and Brianna Hayes holding the other 50%. That's not what Dad told me, he said. Then Dad needs to look at the actual records. Brandon picked up another page. He also wants management changed. He thinks the store needs someone from the family running it while everything gets sorted out. You mean you? He didn't deny it. Someone needs to make decisions. I've been making decisions here for 8 years. I pointed to the payroll records. I hired half these employees. I negotiated with our produce supplier. I handled the weekly inventory. I signed vendor contracts with Matthew. You don't get to walk in because he died and decide I no longer exist as an owner. Brandon's expression tightened. Nobody said you don't exist. You just asked for control of an account that requires my authorization. He looked away for a moment, then said, Dad believes Matthew's share should stay with the family. His share can be handled through the estate. My share has nothing to do with your family. That was the first time Brandon seemed to understand the problem. He had come expecting me to defend the store emotionally, but the documents were more straightforward than he wanted them to be. He opened his phone and called Douglas. I could hear only one side of the conversation. She says the ownership is 50-50, Brandon said. There was a pause. Yes. I have the documents. Another pause. His face changed slightly. Okay. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. Dad wants copies of everything. He can request them through the proper process. He also wants an inventory review. Why? To determine the value of Matthew's interest. I looked at him carefully. That's different from taking control. I know. He hesitated. But Dad is serious about selling the store. The sentence landed harder than I expected. This was not just about a house anymore. They were already discussing the future of a business Matthew and I had built together, and they were doing it before anyone had even finished dealing with his estate. I closed the folder and handed it back to Brandon. If your father wants to challenge ownership, he can do it through the proper channels. Until then, nothing changes here. Brandon stood near the doorway, then stopped before leaving. Dad says his money is what made this store possible. I watched him walk away, and for the first time, I started thinking about every dollar Matthew had ever told me his parents had given him. There had been several payments over the years, but Matthew had always described them as help, not ownership. I had never asked him for every detail because I trusted him. Now I wished I had. I looked back at the company records on the desk and pulled the oldest financial file from the cabinet. If Douglas was going to use those old payments against me, I needed to know exactly what they had been. Rachel returned to the doorway and asked if she should lock the office for me. Yes, I said. And don't give anyone access to the business files without my approval. She nodded and left. I sat down with the oldest file in front of me, not opening it yet, because I already knew whatever was inside would change what I needed to do next. By Wednesday morning, I had every bank statement I could find spread across the dining table. I had barely finished sorting the first stack when I left for Erin Caldwell's office with a folder under my arm. Erin was the attorney I had contacted the day before, and she had asked me to bring anything connected to Matthew's finances. She did not tell me what she thought was going to happen. She simply wanted the records. I handed her the bank statements first, followed by the business account records, mortgage documents, tax returns, and copies of transfers I had found in Matthew's files. Erin went through each page without rushing. She stopped at several transactions, wrote down dates, and asked questions about accounts I recognized. "Do you know why this payment was made?" she asked, pointing to an old transfer. "Matthew told me his parents helped him when he was younger," I said. "I knew they had given him money, but I never kept track of every payment." Erin nodded and continued. She reviewed the mortgage history and compared it with the tax returns. Then she opened the business records and checked whether the money from Matthew's parents had ever been listed as a loan, a capital contribution, or a gift. There was no simple answer in the records I had brought. That afternoon, Douglas called Erin directly. He did not ask to speak with me. He wanted to explain his position. Erin put him on speaker only after asking whether I was comfortable with it. "We gave Matthew the money," Douglas said. His voice was firm. "We supported him before he married Brianna, and some of that money went into the house and the store." Erin did not argue with him. "Did Matthew ever repay it?" she asked. There was a short silence. "He made payments over the years," Douglas said. "Those were family arrangements." Erin looked at me, then back at the phone. "Were those payments documented as repayments of a loan?" Douglas became defensive. "We never needed paperwork between family members." Erin thanked him for the information and ended the call. She did not tell me that he was wrong. Instead, she pushed the records back toward me. "Let's find out what actually happened." I went home and started with Matthew's oldest bank statements. The first few pages showed ordinary expenses, but then I found transfers from an account I recognized as belonging to his parents. Some were small. Others were large enough to stand out. I wrote down each date and amount and compared them with deposits into Matthew's account. Then I checked the years after our marriage. That was where things became more interesting. Several payments had gone in the opposite direction. Matthew had transferred money back to his parents. I found one payment that was much larger than the others. The description field contained 2 words: final repayment. I stared at it for several seconds. I checked the date twice. The transfer had been made years after Matthew and I were married. I pulled the corresponding bank statement from the next month and found no reversal, no refund, and no new transfer from his parents afterward. I called Erin. "I found something." She asked me to send her the statement. A few minutes later, she called back. "This matters," she said. It doesn't prove everything by itself, but it gives us a very different picture. I opened another folder and kept searching. There were more repayments, including several transfers that appeared to match the amounts his parents had previously sent him. The pattern was becoming harder to dismiss as simple family assistance. Douglas had described the money as though it had remained his family's property, but Matthew's records suggested something else. He had received help, used some of it, and then returned money over time. I was still sorting the statements when Aaron called again. "Brianna, I need you to stop looking only at the money coming in and going out." I waited. "We need to know what Matthew intended to happen to everything he owned." "You mean his estate documents?" I asked. "Exactly." She told me to look for the most recent will, any trust documents, beneficiary forms, insurance records, and anything Matthew had signed concerning his property or the business. I wrote the list down and looked toward the hallway. Matthew had kept important papers in a small fireproof box in our bedroom closet. I had not opened it since he died. Aaron's voice softened. "If there's a current estate plan, we need to know about it before your in-laws make another move." I closed the folder of bank statements and stood up. The money trail had answered one question, but it had created another one. What had Matthew actually put in writing about everything he left behind? I asked Aaron whether Douglas could simply claim those old payments without producing anything else. "He can make the claim," she said. "Whether the documents support it is another question." I wrote that down and returned to the bedroom, knowing the next set of papers might matter more than any statement I had found. That evening, I opened the small fireproof box Matthew kept beneath the bedroom closet. The key was taped inside an old envelope, exactly where he had always told me to look if I ever needed something important. I carried the box to the kitchen table and opened it without knowing what I expected to find. Inside were the property deed, insurance papers, retirement account statements, business documents, and several envelopes filled with old letters. I checked every folder twice. There was no complete estate plan, no final will, no trust agreement, nothing that clearly explained what Matthew had intended for the house, the store, or the accounts we had built together. I called Erin and told her what I found. She asked me to photograph the documents and send everything over. A few hours later, she called back. "I checked the records from the attorney who handled Matthew's earlier paperwork," she said. "There was an update." "An update to what?" I asked. "His estate plan. It was revised after you and Matthew had been married for several years." I sat down. "Why didn't I know about it?" "I can't tell you that yet. The file isn't complete on our end." That answer bothered me, but I knew better than to guess. I started going through the old letters instead. Most were ordinary notes from Matthew's parents, holiday cards, and receipts from things we had bought together. Then I found one short note in Matthew's handwriting. It was dated almost a year before he died. There were only a few lines, but one sentence stayed with me. "I'm making sure you're protected." I remembered the conversation immediately. We had been sitting in the car after closing the store, and Matthew had mentioned updating some paperwork. I had asked if everything was okay. He told me not to worry and said he just wanted to make sure I would be protected if something ever happened to him. I had assumed he meant insurance. I never asked more. My phone rang before I could finish sorting the papers. It was Douglas. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, Marilyn sent me an email asking when I planned to vacate the house. She wrote that the family needed access to Matthew's records and that delaying them would only create more problems. I forwarded the message to Aaron without replying. Then Brandon called. "Brianna, I need access to the business account," he said. "For what?" "Dad wants to review the store's finances. He can review them through the proper process. You're making this difficult." "I'm following the ownership documents." He paused before saying, "We're family. That doesn't give you access to an account you don't own." I ended the call before the conversation could turn into another argument. Aaron asked me to forward every message and voicemail I received from them. I did exactly that. By the next afternoon, she had a folder containing the property records, business documents, insurance papers, retirement statements, old correspondence, and every recent message from Matthew's family. She called me after reviewing everything. "Brianna, don't contact them directly for now. If they want something, let them put it in writing." I agreed. She also told me she had contacted the attorney who had handled Matthew's earlier estate paperwork. While she waited for a response, I went back through the box and separated the documents into piles. The property papers went together. The business records went into another folder, and the insurance and retirement documents stayed with the financial statements. I found an old life insurance policy, a retirement account beneficiary form, and several receipts for improvements we had made to the house. None of them answered the question Aaron was asking. There was still no complete estate plan in my hands, but now I knew one had existed. That changed the situation. I was no longer looking for paperwork, simply because Aaron wanted it. I was trying to locate something Matthew had deliberately changed before he died. Later that evening, another message arrived from Marilyn. This one was shorter and more direct. She wanted to know whether I had removed anything belonging to Matthew from the house. I forwarded it to Aaron without answering. Aaron replied that I should keep every original document where it was and avoid giving anyone copies until she had reviewed the estate file. She also asked whether Matthew had ever mentioned a specific attorney by name. I gave her the name I remembered from an old folder, along with the address printed on the letterhead. She told me she would follow up herself. I went back to the fireproof box and found one more envelope tucked behind the retirement statements. It contained nothing related to the will, but it had the same attorney's letterhead. I placed it beside the other papers and waited for Aaron's next call. The next morning, Aaron called while I was at the store. "Brianna, I just received an email from Matthew's former attorney." I stepped into the office and closed the door. "What did it say?" Aaron was quiet for a moment. Then she read the message aloud. "I found the file you were looking for." The following morning, Aaron placed 3 folders on her desk and told me to start with the first one. "This is the property file," she said. "The second is the business. The third covers Matthew's financial accounts." I opened the first folder and found the deed to our house, the mortgage records, and a history of payments made over the years. Aaron pointed to the ownership section. "The house was purchased during your marriage, and both of you were listed on the deed." She turned to the next page. "That means Matthew's share is part of his estate, but your ownership interest is not something his parents can simply claim." I nodded, but I was still trying to understand how much of the estate we were talking about. Aaron opened the second folder. The business records confirmed what I had already seen at the store. Matthew owned 50% of Hayes Family Market, and I owned the other 50%. His parents were not listed as owners. There were no documents transferring my share to them, and there was nothing showing that Douglas had any authority to take control of the company. "So they can't take the store," I said. "They can't take your half," Aaron replied. "Matthew's half is different because it passes through his estate." She opened the third folder. Inside were statements from investment accounts, brokerage records, and stock holdings. Aaron went through each account and checked the beneficiary information against the estate documents. Then she placed a calculator beside the folders and began adding the values. The house was worth $520,000. Matthew's interest in the supermarket was valued at $410,000. His investment accounts totaled $145,000. The stocks were worth $75,000, and the remaining assets came to $50,000. Aaron wrote the total on a sheet of paper, $1,200,000. I stared at the number. Until that moment, I had been thinking about individual accounts and the house. I had not looked at everything as one estate. Aaron then pulled out the updated estate plan she had obtained from Matthew's former attorney. "This is the document your in-laws don't know about," she said. I read the first page carefully. Matthew had named me as the primary beneficiary of the assets covered by the plan. The language also recognized the property and his ownership interest in the business. "He really did this?" I asked. "Yes," Aaron said. "And it was signed and witnessed according to the requirements that applied when it was executed." I kept reading. The document did not erase every legal question, but it made Matthew's intention clear. His parents were not named as beneficiaries of the assets covered by the plan. His brother was not named either. My phone started ringing before I finished the last page. It was Douglas. I let it ring once, then answered. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to know what you and Aaron are doing with Matthew's money," he said. "We're reviewing his estate. You have no right to shut us out." "I'm not shutting anyone out. I'm following the documents." Douglas's voice became sharper. Those documents don't tell the whole story. Matthew was under pressure. You influenced him. I looked at Erin. She was already writing something down. Are you saying Matthew wasn't capable of making his own decisions? I asked. I'm saying you were involved in everything. I was his wife. Exactly, Douglas said. You had access to him. You had influence over his money and his business. I ended the call after he refused to answer whether he had any document proving his claim. Erin looked at me. That's the argument they're going to use, that I influenced him? Yes, if they challenge the estate plan, they may argue that Matthew didn't act independently when he made these decisions. I looked down at the document in front of me, but he signed it with a lawyer. That helps us, Erin said. It doesn't automatically end the dispute. Later that day, Marilyn sent an email saying the family intended to contest the estate. Brandon followed with a message demanding that I preserve every business record because they were considering legal action. I forwarded both messages to Erin. She read them and leaned back in her chair. They're moving quickly. So are we. Erin nodded. Then we need to prove what Matthew intended. She gathered the folders and placed them back in front of me. The estate plan is important, but I want to know what else Matthew left behind that can confirm he understood exactly what he was doing. Before I could ask what she meant, Erin reached into a separate envelope she had received from Matthew's former attorney. She pulled out a single document I had never seen before and placed it face down on the desk. This wasn't included in the estate plan. I looked at her. What is it? Erin turned the document over, and the first line immediately caught my attention. 2 days later, Erin called me back to her office before the courthouse had even opened. She had the file from Matthew's former attorney on her desk, along with several documents I had never seen. This is the final will, she said, sliding the first document toward me. I read the date and Matthew's signature. It was the version he had signed after we had been married, and it named me as the primary beneficiary. Erin placed the remaining papers beside it. Business ownership records, repayment records showing money sent back to his parents, an email from Matthew discussing his plans, and a signed statement confirming that he understood what he was leaving behind. These documents give us a strong position, Erin said, but they don't guarantee your in-laws will accept it. She was right. By the time we reached the courthouse, Douglas had already filed a petition challenging the estate plan. His argument was simple. He claimed his family had financed Matthew's life before and during the early years of his marriage, and he wanted the court to treat those contributions as evidence that Matthew's estate should not pass to me as written. When we entered the hearing room, Douglas was seated beside his attorney. Marilyn sat behind him, while Brandon remained near the aisle. I sat beside Erin and kept my attention on the documents in front of me. The judge asked both sides to explain their positions. Douglas's attorney spoke first. He described the money Douglas and Marilyn had given Matthew over the years and argued that those contributions had created an expectation that the family would remain involved in Matthew's property and business. Douglas was then asked to speak. Matthew's parents financed his life, he said. We helped him get through school, helped him buy a car, helped him establish himself, and gave him money when he started the store. We were there before Brianna. I listened without interrupting. Erin did not react either. When it was our turn, she stood and placed the first set of records before the judge. The issue is not whether Matthew's parents helped him, she said. The issue is whether those payments gave them ownership rights over assets Matthew later owned, or whether they were gifts and loans that were already repaid. She submitted the repayment records. The documents showed several transfers from Matthew back to his parents, including the large payment marked Final Repayment. Erin explained the dates and showed that the transfers continued after Matthew's marriage. Douglas's attorney argued that the payments did not prove the money had been fully repaid, but Erin moved to the next set of documents. Then let's look at the business. She presented the company records showing that Matthew owned 50% of Hayes Family Market and I owned the other 50%. There was no ownership interest listed for Douglas, Marilyn, or Brandon. Erin explained that my share had been mine throughout the marriage and that only Matthew's share was part of his estate. Douglas's attorney tried to argue that the store had been built with money originally provided by Matthew's parents. Erin acknowledged that some early funding had come from them, then presented the records showing that those funds had been repaid or accounted for through Matthew's financial records. The argument shifted again. Next came the property documents. Erin showed the deed listing both Matthew and me as owners of the house. She explained the mortgage history and pointed out that payments had continued throughout our marriage. Douglas's attorney questioned whether Matthew's original contribution gave his parents an interest in the property. Erin responded that the deed, mortgage records, and subsequent ownership history did not support that claim. The judge asked Douglas's attorney whether there was a signed agreement giving his clients an ownership interest in the house or business. There was a pause before the attorney answered. Not at this time. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I did not need to argue with Douglas. Every claim was being tested against a document. After the property records were reviewed, Erin returned to the estate plan. She presented the final will, the signed statement, and the email from Matthew. The email was not dramatic. Matthew had simply written that he wanted his wife protected and that he expected the documents to be handled according to his instructions. Erin explained that the will had been prepared and executed with legal counsel, and that the supporting records showed Matthew understood the nature of his property and the people he had chosen to benefit. Douglas's expression changed as the hearing continued. He had expected the money he once gave his son to carry more weight than the paperwork in front of the court. Instead, each document narrowed his argument. When the judge asked whether there were additional materials, Erin stood quietly. There's one more piece. She looked at me for a moment, then turned toward the judge. We received it from Matthew's former attorney after this dispute began, and it was not included in the estate plan itself. She placed a sealed envelope on the table. Douglas leaned forward. Brandon looked at his father. Erin kept her hand on the envelope but did not open it. What is it? The judge asked. Erin looked toward me once more. It may answer the question of what Matthew actually intended. The hearing resumed the following Monday. Erin arrived with the sealed envelope from Matthew's former attorney, and I could tell from her expression that whatever was inside mattered. The judge asked whether either side had new evidence. Erin requested permission to present the document. Inside was a USB drive and a signed letter from the attorney, confirming that the drive contained a video Matthew had recorded several months before his death. Douglas objected, but the judge reviewed the attorney's statement and allowed the recording to be played. Matthew appeared on the screen, sitting at a desk in the back office of the supermarket. He looked tired, but his voice was steady. If you're watching this, something happened that I hoped I would never have to prepare for, he said. I want to explain something clearly because I don't want my family arguing over money after I'm gone. He spoke about his parents first. He said they had helped him when he was younger and that he was grateful for their support. He also explained that he had repaid the money they had provided, including the larger final payment shown in his bank records. My parents helped me get started, Matthew said. I will always be grateful for that, but the money they gave me was not an ownership agreement, and I do not want anyone treating it like one. Douglas shifted in his seat. Matthew continued. Hayes Family Market belongs to Brianna and me. We built it together. She owns half, and I own the other half. If something happens to me, my share should be handled according to my estate plan. Brianna's share is hers. He then addressed the house, explaining that it was where he and I had built our life together and that he wanted my ownership interest protected. He specifically stated that his parents were not entitled to take the property simply because they had helped him financially before our marriage. Then came the sentence that made Douglas lower his eyes. I don't want my family fighting over what Brianna and I built together. The recording lasted only a few minutes. Matthew did not insult anyone or ask me to punish his family. He simply explained what he owned, what he had repaid, and what he wanted done after his death. When it ended, the judge admitted the recording and its supporting documents into evidence. Douglas's attorney asked for time to review them, and the judge granted a short recess. In the hallway, Douglas approached me. You knew about this? He asked. No, you expect me to believe that? I didn't know Matthew recorded it. He stared at me, then returned to his attorney. When the hearing resumed, Douglas's attorney argued that the video could not replace the will or determine ownership by itself. Erin agreed, then explained why it mattered. We are not presenting this video as a replacement for the estate plan. We are presenting it as evidence of Matthew's understanding and intent. His statements are consistent with the final will, the business records, the property documents, and the repayment history. The judge reviewed the evidence again. The final will named me as the primary beneficiary. The business records confirmed the 50-50 ownership structure. The deed confirmed my ownership interest in the house. The repayment record showed that Matthew had returned money to his parents. The video connected those documents to Matthew's own understanding. Douglas's attorney claimed Matthew had been influenced by me, but the judge asked what evidence supported that accusation. There was no medical record, witness statement, or other document showing that Matthew had been unable to make independent decisions. After reviewing everything, the judge ruled that Douglas and Marilyn had not established a legal basis to take my share of the house, my half of the supermarket, or the assets Matthew had directed to me through his estate plan. Their claim to the estate failed. The judge also confirmed that Matthew's parents could not turn past financial assistance into ownership of property they were never listed as owning. I did not feel victorious. I felt relieved that Matthew's decisions had been respected. For the first time since Matthew died, I knew exactly where I stood, and I could make decisions about the future without waiting for another demand from his family. In the weeks that followed, I returned to Hayes Family Market and met with the employees. We kept the business running without changing its name or ownership structure. Matthew's name remained in the original records, and I kept his photograph in the office where he used to handle the morning orders. The house remained my home, and I never packed the boxes Douglas had ordered me to prepare. The legal process eventually closed, and the documents were stored safely with Aaron. My relationship with Matthew's family changed permanently, but I stopped trying to force an explanation from people who had already shown me what they valued. I learned that family support does not automatically create ownership, and gratitude does not mean surrendering your rights. I also learned that protecting yourself does not require becoming cruel to other people. Matthew had prepared for a future he hoped would never come, and because he put his wishes in writing, I was able to protect the life we had built. If there is one thing I want anyone watching this to understand, it is that love and trust should never replace clear records when money, property, or a business is involved. Have the difficult conversations while everyone is still alive. Put agreements in writing. Know what you own, know what you owe, and make sure the people you trust understand your wishes. I still miss Matthew, but I no longer measure what he left me by the value of the estate. What mattered most was that when the hardest moment came, his own words were there to tell the truth about the life we had built together.